Okay, thank you everybody for coming along. So I'm Cathy Lomax, and this is Cathie Pilkington. Kind of weird to have two Cathys together, but I guess it happens occasionally. So, yeah, we're going to just chat about some aspects of our practices and some themes that we've sort of realised that connect things that we make and are interested in, and see how it goes, really, I guess. Yeah.
I think it's great to have this opportunity for us to talk as well, because we've actually known each other for a long time. I've shown at Transition Gallery that Cathy runs and initiated. Did you open it 18 years ago? Or?
Yeah, 2002.
So I think I've done 3 shows with you.
I'll take your word for it.
And so it's really great now, I think, after all those years as well, to sort of look back and see where our practices kind of do this sort of, there are collisions, aren't there, in what we do and think about.
Yeah.
And it's nice as well at this point in, I mean, I might just be speaking for myself, but at this point I think in your life, when you've maybe been working for so long, you've had your kids, you've done different stuff, and then you're looking back over stuff, and it's really interesting time to reflect on things that, and maybe you speak quite differently about things that you did quite a while ago.
Yeah, it is interesting looking back at older work and sort of reassessing it from a distance, I think. That's kind of one thing that doing a talk like this always makes you do, when you're flicking through all these your images and you're like, oh God, I've forgotten about that.
And I think what you said about, rather than us just saying, doing the sort of chronological thing where we said, and then we did this, and we thought we'd try and pick out these moments where there are interesting crossovers. Yeah,
so the first sort of thing that we were thinking about, because we did have a little meeting where we, had a sort of pre-discussion.
Cathy told me to be quiet.
And the first thing that we thought that we would sort of realise that we were both quite interested in was fairy tales, and the kind of darkness that's inherent in those stories. So, I don't know, I guess I've always made work about fairy tales. I remember one of the first things I did was I was looking at Red Riding Hood and dolls dressed in Red Riding Hood outfits, and films that reference Red Riding Hood, so it is a recurring theme. And when I was thinking about this, because I wanted to, as Cathy said, we wanted to include images and references that weren't just to sort of run through the work that we've made. And I'm really interested in films, watching films, taking imagery from films. And so the film that came to mind was Company of Wolves, which I haven't seen for ages, but it was such an important film when I first saw it, and the imagery is so striking. And that kind of twisted fairy tale aspect of it, I think, is great. Which brings us on to, some of the work you've made.
Yeah, I think I quite often start talking about these 1970s Ladybird illustrations by Robert Lumley that I came across when I was a child, and I reread them to my daughter. And there was a very, very particular materiality about those illustrations. They're really kind of physical, and your proximity to making and the magic sort of essence in material is what always drew me into those pictures. And I guess that at that time I didn't go to art galleries, didn't know anything about art. This was my kind of real sort of visual starting point, and my kind of obsession with something that sort of bristled with, there is a kind of libidinous kind of tension in the way the materiality is depicted, and so I always return to them, and I think the work that I made at a certain point in time, when my daughter was little and I revisited them, I made a series of work that very literally returned to some of those pictures. And I redid the narrative, so I changed them around and swapped them around and played around with some of the stories and meanings. So in this one that was called mother. This is from that story, The Wolf and the Seven Kids. And in that story, they killed the wolf. The wolf had swallowed all the kids whole. And then the wolf had gone to sleep, so the mother had come out and cut his stomach open while he was asleep, and all the kids had popped out. And then she had to stitch his stomach up. She filled his stomach full of boulders and then stitched his stomach up. And yeah, I mean, incredible that he slept so heavily, but that's medical. But in this one, the story, so it's a direct copy of that image of her stitching this very particular kind of activity that goes on in the picture that you're really kind of proximate to. But it's no longer a wolf, it's like a giant baby that she's somehow got to kind of fix.
But the image of the man.
Yeah, this is from the elves and the sheep.
Right, yeah, that's not from that
No, so but that's just an example of him cutting the leather out.
Yeah, I just so remember looking at those Ladybird books, and the illustrations were just so beautiful, I thought.
Incredibly vivid, yeah.
And colour, which
The
was
colour.
something
Look
special,
at that
wasn't
pink leather. He made a really amazing fancy pair of pink leather boots for a lady that turns up later in the story, and you just like gagging for the boots, yeah.
Yeah, there's something about the colour, isn't it? When I think about them, I think of red, I suppose, something like Red Riding Hood. And that's what's so great in Company of Wolves, the colours are just so rich and vivid, and she puts on the red lipstick, little girl, and then she's the red cloak, and there's just something really kind of...
Yeah, it's so laden, isn't it, with symbolism.
Absolutely. I don't know what these blue eggs were. I think in the film she tells lots of different fairy stories, and these blue eggs are something to do with the story. I can't remember, but it's like such a nice image. And then it has a mirror image in it, which is something that I'm really interested in. Been making lots of work about mirrors, and the little painting there is a blank mirror, because
I love that painting.
Yeah, I like the idea of mirrors not showing anything.
Yeah,
because that doesn't ever happen, does it? Because when you look at one, it's showing something. So something kind of quite frightening.
And very interesting where the painting becomes an object as well. That happens quite a lot, doesn't it, with your work later on.
Yeah, should we go on to see? Oh yeah, I want to know about these because I don't really know much. Is this the Tar Baby? Something like that?
It's a kind of mixture, isn't it? That image was taken, and these were made when I was breastfeeding, so I had a very ambivalent relationship with motherhood. So the first one on your left is called Surrogate, and it's a direct transcription from a photograph of the Harry Harlow infant attachment experiments that were done, where the psychologist took the babies away from their mother and then made people nodding. It's a very well known documented experiment. Different kind of mother surrogates were made. One was wire and provided milk, and the other one was soft and comfortable and provided no milk. And the infants all attached to the soft, comfortable one that didn't feed them. So it was quite an interesting and quite a harrowing, because they took a lot of monkeys away from their mothers in order to kind of do the psychological experiment. And the other one is taken from a Rubens, The Slaughter of the Innocents, of a mother trying to feed their child and the child pushing away while lots of other children are being slaughtered in the background. So it's quite a kind of the way I've actually treated, I've chosen to bring in a bear instead of a mother, and the bear is treated in this way that it's made very, very quickly and painted in gloss paint, so it feels very slippery, and the whole thing kind of feels kind of desperate and difficult. So, and I think the surrogate one was really important to me because it sort of works on lots of different levels, which when I select a theme, I always seem to be drawn to something that has those layers in it. So on one hand you're talking about the experiment, on the other hand you're talking about moving from a photograph into a sculpture, And then within that, you're talking about different kinds of sculptural languages. So the baby's very naturalistic, but the mother is very provisional and formal and kind of using a reductive sort of language. So there's a kind of conversation about representation as well as all the other stuff. So it's very fascinating to me.
I love the fact that it's got one of the materials is cheese box.
Yeah, and that's the head. That's the cheese box head, and
right. Do you know what?
the
I thought
reflectors
it was
as
the,
eyes.
The kind of wicker bit. I thought, oh, that must be a box you keep cheese in. I didn't think it was
That's pegboard actually that's behind it, one of my favourite materials. But yeah, so it's made to scale from the photograph, and the mother was actually made using bike reflectors as eyes and an old cheese box, and because they're just cobbled together in a laboratory. So yes, direct.
Should I go on to the next?
Yeah.
Oh, so this is one of mine, my paintings, my film diary paintings. So I watch lots of films, and for this series I make a small painting from every film I watch and then assemble them together into a block. And when I was thinking about fairy tales and the Gothic actually as well, which I think kind of relates to those fairy tales, lots of my favourite films do have that Gothic angle, and the stories, the narrative in them is often, there aren't that many variations on the story in classic Hollywood films, I think, which I watch a lot of. So it's almost as though they are grown-up fairy tales, a lot of them. They're very simplistic, the goodies, the baddies. Baddies have to suffer in the end. The bad women, and I particularly like the little one in the corner, which has got a wig on a kind of block, which has some kind of really always feels very dark to me, like somebody removing their hair and something strange.
Girls' world gone wrong.
Girls' world gone wrong, exactly. But when I make these paintings, I do, although I look at film stills and use the film stills to make the painting, I do reconfigure them and change the colours. So I think the colour palette in this particular group is kind of working against the Gothic a bit. It's like quite pastel-y, which I always find really interesting how much can change when you just sort of mess around with the colour palette a bit.
So how do you select the image that you're going to paint from watching the film?
Just whatever stands out to me, really. So usually when I watch a film, I'll watch it on my laptop and I'll just be taking loads of screenshots.
Right.
All the way through. And then I'll look at them afterwards and print out a bunch that I like and put them all over the wall, and then see what works with the other films, so I start to kind of make a
So it's quite formal.
In a way, there is a real formality, and I start to kind of like things sometimes, like if there's a woman asleep, then for some reason, there's a woman asleep. That's quite interesting. And then I can start looking for more women asleep, and put them together, and these sort of little things. In fact, there are lots of women asleep.
That's a really interesting one, isn't it? The sleep. I watched on Cathy's recommendation. I walked with a zombie last night, and that does have a woman who's permanently asleep. Which is very glamorous. And
I don't know if anybody knows it, but it's not a zombie film at all. It's based on Jane Eyre and set in the Caribbean. And it was made as a sort of horror B movie by RKO in the 40s, and the producer, the way it worked, he was just given a title to make a film. So he was told, right, you've got to go make I Walk with the Zombie. And he wasn't really into horror films, so he used to take these titles and subvert them as much as possible and make these really interesting psychological films. He also made Cat People and The Seventh Victim. So they're all, they sound like they're one thing, and actually when you watch them, they're
quite something else.
Yeah. Although they do have, the sort of B-movie clunkiness a bit, which I really like.
Which you love, personally.
So
that when you're talking about the sort of archetypes in fairy tale, and then how those simple ideas get put across into classic film. You know, the bad woman, there's that. How do you feel about those kind of very clear demarcations of character?
I don't really know actually.
But do they kind of, do you get cross about how women are shown, or do you love it? Or
It's a mixture of the two.
yeah.
I quite like really bad women in films. I think that's really interesting. The femme fatale, who, you know, she was the centre of the film. She was so bad, and I think there's something quite fascinating about that. The bad thing is that she always had to die. That was the production code. You could have bad women in films in the
As long as you killed them.
40s and 50s
Yeah.
and 60s, but they had to, you know, pay for their terribleness. So it's almost as though you should just ignore the ends of most of those films, because I don't think the writers or the directors wanted them to die, but they, oh gosh, they
Just had to.
yeah. So that's a bit disappointing, but it's sort of part of the story of the time, but it is just what it is. And not that all of the films are from that period. There are some more contemporary films. I don't know what, if any of these are. I kind of forget what the films are usually after a while.
How long have you been doing the film diary?
Since, well, we did it for about 8 years, I think. Something like that, yeah.
Did you keep a diary as a girl?
No.
No.
Did you?
Not really.
No. I was just too terrified that someone would find it, and that would be so excruciating. I guess I could have made it in code or something.
Far too much effort.
Yeah.
You could be painting instead.
Yeah, exactly. So much better. Yeah. Oh, some more kind of
Yeah.
fairy tale-ish.
And a real collision as well here with.
Stylistically,
Yeah.
the dressing tables are very
Exactly.
different.
Yeah.
Yeah, we realised that we both like dressing tables, or are interested in dressing tables, should we say. Do you have a dressing table?
Do I have a dressing table? No. No. My grandma had an amazing dressing table though, and it was a little bit like that you could actually step into.
The one that, your one?
My one, yeah.
Not that kind of ugly.
I really like that one. I like the other one.
Do you?
Yeah.
It's not actually mine, so you can be rude about it.
So this is really interesting because there's lots of things that link them, and then they really go off in completely different directions as well, don't they? So shall I talk about my one?
Yeah,
You can talk about your one.
Because I want to
Cathy
know
and
about
Cathy's dressing table. So this is, the way I might speak about it now is different to how I would speak about it when I was making it. And when I was making it, the thing that started the work off was that I really wanted to I was making these sculptures of children that were a bit like charity shop boxes or mannequins or dolls. They were somewhere in the middle of all of those things. And I was really interested in making sculptures that were like pictures and like tableaus and were very vivid like those fairy tale books. And I was making this girl, and the most important thing about the sculpture was that she couldn't reach the floor with her feet, and the way the feet hovered like children do when they sit on a chair. So I've been making her for some time, and I was thinking, you know, what am I going to put her on? And I literally walked around the corner one day, and this was in this junk shop. So that's how those two things first of all came together, which quite often happens when I'm working. You start with one thing and then things gather around them. But now I see it completed, and it does all these different things. I think that it's one of those very important pieces that you make that you can go back to and think all the things that you thought about subsequently were kind of going on then. So you know, the sculpture it's not real, but it's pretending to be real, and she's pretending to look in the mirror again that's not real, and she's surrounded by inanimate objects that are ornaments. So there's this question mark about what's alive, what's inanimate, uncertainties around who she is, and I think it's very psychological. It's about kind of working out who you are in the world and how you fit into things. And there's lots of layers to it. It could be quite narrative. And then formally, you've got this very upright mirror, and her hair is done in this ridiculous beehive, so she becomes an object, a child's doll object, like the objects that she's surrounded with, that are just taken from bric-a-brac and all sprayed brown, so they become this gesture.
And has it changed over time when you show it again?
You know it, don't you? Yes, I changed her hair colour actually.
Oh really? I didn't realise.
Yeah, she was a redhead at first.
Oh.
And that was just about making it more formal, it just seemed after a few years. And I've shown her in lots of different places and different situations as well. So this is at Dorwich House, which is Dora Gordine's amazing live-work studio space in Kingston. And I was lucky enough to do a residency there a couple of years ago. And this is actually Dora's dressing room, so I took it into the dressing room.
I love the curtains.
Curtains are very David Lynch, aren't they?
Fleshy colour.
Yeah.
So nice. Yeah, it worked really well in there.
Yeah.
Well, my dressing table, this work was in a show called This Me of Mine, that was a touring group show. And this, I think, was the final leg. Maybe it had been shown in about 3 or 4 venues. This was the final venue. And I had these paintings in the show, the 2 bigger paintings, which are of Priscilla Presley, when she first kind of got together with Elvis properly. So I don't know if people know the story of Priscilla and Elvis, but he met her when she was very young, when she was 13 or 14, and sort of kept seeing her on a sort of friendly basis, but eventually, and that was in Germany, and eventually she flew to America to live in his house when she was still under 16, and then they got married. Who knows what went on, but she was very, very young, and he used to like to dress her up, and he used to tell her how he liked her to look. So he was like, I want you to dye your hair black, I want you to have a huge beehive. It's actually a beehive relationship, although it's chopped off in those. I like you to wear lots of makeup, and he used to take her shopping and buy her dresses. So
it's like a living doll.
Yeah, definitely. And there's this one image which you see reproduced a lot if there's anything about Priscilla and Elvis. And I always become very fascinated when that happens, when there's one image that represents something and you just see it over and over and over again. So I started to paint it in lots of different ways, because it wasn't, I guess it wasn't really anything to do with how she thought she should look or wanted to look. It was a complete, creation.
Yeah.
And then it just seemed like a really good idea to show the little paintings, which were in found frames, on a dressing table. Just imagine Priscilla sitting there in her beehive.
It's an incredible collision, isn't it, of imagery?
Yeah, and it kind of worked really well, but it was just a borrowed dressing table from somebody, a friend of somebody's in Ipswich, that they lent me for the occasion. But I do have a dressing table in my studio that I acquired from somewhere, that I haven't ever used in a show, but I just like it in the studio. I put things on it and do things with it, which actually looks a bit more like your dressing table. And I collect images of dressing tables as well.
Yeah, you definitely flirt with installation, don't you, quite a lot? Yeah,
I always sort of dream about doing some really elaborate installation, but actually when it happens it usually gets pared down and there's not that much of it left, but maybe one day. Yeah, maybe one day that dressing table can come out of the studio.
And I think that those 2 images are interesting in that kind of this idea of outward appearance and more of a psychological charge to facing yourself as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. So yeah, these are two of my images, and the first one is an installation of small works on paper that was at a show called Beauty Salon, and then the second one is a slightly larger painting. I'm really interested in makeup at the moment, and you know, as sort of shown by those paintings of Priscilla and the dressing table, this idea of makeup as something which transforms you, which can maybe show how you're feeling. You know, you can paint your face to show how you feel to the world, or to completely hide you, or it can just be a kind of uniform. It seems to be such a malleable material. And I'm also really interested in the idea of painting makeup, so using paint like makeup, so the actual stuff of paint becoming the skin and the lipstick and the rouge, and there's something quite satisfying about painting your face, and then you can, should I put this much blush on? No, that's not quite right, I'll rub it out a little bit. How should I make the lips look? I mean, there is something very, there's a real synchronicity, I think, between the ideas
Yeah,
of
really interesting.
makeup and painting. And also the other thing that comes across in these images is I've been using lots of advertising images and making paintings from them. I wasn't really quite sure why to start with, apart from the fact that I really think they're fantastic images, like the Mary Quant adverts from the 60s and 70s, and mostly older adverts. They were just really, really super creative. There was a period, it seems, when advertising was really creative. And you look at the ads now and they're much more literal.
Yeah.
You get a photograph of a pot of cream and someone kind of doing that, and that's about it. So that's sort of fascinating. I love that sociology.
Some of those Dora Maar.
Oh yeah, the surrealist.
The photography was great, wasn't it? The, hair washing and
yeah, I think advertising kind of runs alongside editorial in magazines, and maybe we don't realise how different it is, but it kind of really does show the period it was made in. And this, the bigger painting, is from an ad from the 70s, and there is something quite nostalgic about it for me. I mean, we mentioned nostalgia, didn't we? And it's kind of a bit of a, oh, I don't want to be nostalgic. But I do remember that kind of look in Jackie magazine and all those magazines. And I was thinking about why I'm drawn to that kind of imagery. And actually, usually, I sort of look back a bit further in history and look at a period before I was around. But maybe the 70s do have a little bit of a allure because of that remembering growing up and
I just think 70s films are like the best films ever made.
You see, I don't really think they are, but I prefer the 40s and 50s in films.
Yeah.
So I don't know what that says, because can you be nostalgic for a time before you
Well,
were around?
weren't you watching those films at your grandparents' houses?
Not really.
No,
it's pretty much more recent. So I don't know what that's about. But I love the colours anyway of the makeup as well. I guess there's like a pop art reference going on here. That idea of elevating everyday objects and advertising and kind of making it into artworks, and that slightly feels a bit subversive. I mean, there is the whole thing about makeup and femininity being not generally considered as a serious subject for art. It's not, it's not the sublime, it's not beautiful, it's not minimal, it's excessive, it's over-coloured, it's this sort of temporary makeup, is this temporary thing which just wears off, it doesn't last, it's all about superficiality and surface. And that's why I want to make paintings.
For
all
so
those reasons.
you're flying in the face of the male painter, is easy with his oil paint, aren't you, by making these works.
by making oil paintings of makeup.
Yeah.
That's the
Exactly.
basic. It's just troublemaking, really.
Have you ever used makeup to make paintings with? You know, like
I did
main
used
paintings
to, actually. When I was really young, I remember doing some, and I found recently some like face prints I made where I put on loads of makeup and kind of rolled my face across paper when I was about 16 or something.
Really?
Yeah, they're quite nice. But I haven't done it recently. So I think because I was doing that when I was that age, it's like a very adolescent idea maybe. So I haven't returned to it, but could do, I guess. Could do, an idea. So yeah, we get on to some heads and busts. Now this painting of mine, this green lady, I actually quite hate, and Cathy said, oh yeah, I really want you to show that image. So, you know.
So it's all my fault.
Yeah. So I can't resist somebody saying they like something.
What was this painted from, Cathy? What were you looking at?
I must have been looking at a sculpture. I can't remember who. And I don't think it was green. I think I made it green. But other than that, I can't really recall why I chose it. It was just a period when I was painting lots of portrait busts, making paintings of sculptures, and thinking about this idea of women being turned to stone and idealised, and how throughout art history women have much easier to cope with if they're made of stone and they don't move around and they're not flesh and blood, they're just this beautiful inanimate object.
Static.
Yeah,
image,
you can display them
you
and
can deal with them.
they don't age.
Yeah.
They're not at all needy.
Yeah.
So that was sort of the thinking behind for making this series.
Yeah.
Rather like I Walk with a Zombie and the zombified comatose lady and
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
Something about those women.
That just appear, and that's
So
their
it's
role.
sort of frightening, but also quite manageable.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'm really interested in it because it kind of crosses over from a kind of more of a photographic representation of something into an object. And so for me, you know, I make objects and paint them, and you paint things and you've kind of turned it into an object. So there's that lovely kind of crossover that I think makes things really interesting, because you're not quite sure what the starting point is, but it references lots of things all at once. So when I was kind of moving from something that was more naturalistic, like the girl at the dressing table, I'm trying to find a sort of a more pared back language to tackle figuration. Because I don't want it to be, at this point, I don't want it to be narrative, I don't want it to be tied to a story. So I started making these, you know, sculpture, in mid-century sculpture, you know, that kind of transition from figurative language to formal language is full of the head as object, and these pared back objects that are almost indistinguishable from a particular person. I became really interested in how little information you needed when you made something for us to project onto it and think it's figurative. You don't need much, you know, we do that instantly onto everything. So this is one of the first things that I made where I closed, instead of starting from life, I started from looking at a souvenir doll. It was a Welsh doll with a sort of unusual shaped face that was to do with the way it was produced and cast. So she was my unlife model, and I sculpted her with eyes that looked like they could open. So instead of making something that pretended to be real, it definitely wasn't.
So there's those, there could be those eyes that you put some blink.
Yeah.
And
And also that, you know, took away that when you were talking about painting makeup on, you know, you haven't done it here because you're working from a sculpture. I haven't really painted, you know, because on the earlier work I did do exactly the same thing, where you paint the face and do the cheeks and all of that, and that has been sort of rubbed out. So it's talking more about, you know, idea of classical Greek sculpture not being coloured, which
although
of course it was. Yeah.
Well, she does have pink lips, a green lady.
She does, and so does mine.
Yeah. Well, there you go. We couldn't resist a bit of that. And then this one of yours is even more pared back. So this is later.
It's actually at the same time as that other one. So yeah, it definitely more pared back, and looking at those really reduced, primitive folk dolls that are made of cloth, and they just literally these shapes that are stitched together, and often they've got printed faces or painted faces, or wool hair, you know, and thinking about that and modernism and good object, bad object, thinking about objects and how you could kind of insinuate things about an object very, very easily or simply. And I love your painting, which looks like the back of my sculpture.
If she had any hair.
Well, a lot of them do, so...
Okay. But yeah, it's interesting how yours, as you were saying before, you know, reducing the detail, the figuration, it still does absolutely read as a head in shoulders, doesn't it? I guess she's got the collar, which helps.
But I think even if you took that off, and I did I worked in series and made a few different versions of this, and yeah, they read, and they're called busts as well. And they're literally sawn off at the bust. So some of them have no face, but they have breasts that are very clearly painted, and the face is blank. So it's sort of playing around with, representation and how we project onto things.
Yeah, the painting of mine is from a series called The Merry Maidens, which is named after a stone circle near Newlyn in Cornwall, where a group of girls were dancing on the Sabbath when they weren't meant to be, and then they were apparently turned to stone. And I think it's such a sad story, and kind of fits quite well with the idea of the film noirs where the heroine has to die. You know, the girls have to suffer always. They're just having a good time. So yeah, so I made a bunch of Merry Maidens paintings to kind of bring them back to life, but obviously not really, it's just paintings. Oh yeah, so this one's a bit different because it's installation, isn't it? But I thought because there's a whole group of the heads there, and is that... No, that isn't the one we've just seen.
There's some similar ones lurking in the background. Yeah, this is one of the installations I built recently. This was at Callan House Museum, and it was in the bedroom. So I took over 4 rooms in the museum and mixed my work with work from the collection, which was amazingly good fun. And when I first went to look around the museum, the odd thing in that museum is that it's an old townhouse, or part of the gallery is an old townhouse. There's a modern part of it as well. But there's this odd bits of furniture throughout it, and first of all you think that the furniture fits with the period of the house, and then as you look further you realise there's all kinds of odd bits and pieces that have gathered over the years. And one of them is this odd 4-poster, amazing Hepper white bed, but it had this kind of old 80s bed cover on it, and it's just in the middle of, looking at all this modernist painting, and then there's this odd bedspread. And I thought, well, if I'm going to inhabit this room, then I really want to use the bed as part of the work and part of the installation. So in the centre of the bedroom was this installation on the bed called Good Bed, Bad Bed. It's such a fundamental piece of furniture, isn't it? A bed is so personal, and it cuts through all kinds of ideas of wandering around a gallery, because it's like a body in the middle of the room. So I treated the bed like it was kind of a bedscape. It was a painting and a sculpture and a picture and a bed all at the same time. It was quite theatrical as well. And there were lots of ideas going on in there to do with that painting, Christina's World, the Wyeth painting of the blind or cripple in the field longing towards the homestead. There's this kind of sense of longing, and this figure has got these toy-like floppy legs, and you can't see her face in this, but her eyes are just breasts, so she can't see either. And she's gesturing towards all these blank faces, these ancestors, all kind of unclear and ambivalent sort of ideals that she's sort of gesturing towards. So it's quite a melancholic, and the quilt is kind of taken from De Chirico and that kind of metaphysical painting. There's a lot of longing and dark shadows. So it's a kind of way of dealing with the history of the space and the status, I guess, of sculpture and where I feel in relation to sculpture and painting and toys and all of those sort of questions I have about, throughout my career, if you want to call it that, with those questions of how you fit in and who your ancestors are and where are you going with your practice and what is it,
and as
kind of
part
mix that all in.
Of this taking over the gallery, you put lots of photographs of women artists around, didn't you? You selected them, which was really interesting.
Yeah, so there was one room, in fact, when I was looking through the collection, first of all I'm looking, of course, for women artists in the collection, and there were so few. But what I did find was Lord Snowdon had an amazing collection of women in their studios, practitioners in their studios, and they're really, really fantastic pictures. Most of them were smoking as well, so they're really full of attitude. And
that was essential. Right?
It was essential, yeah. So there was one room that kind of felt like it was a dark room. It felt like a sort of smoking room, and so I set these women up together in amongst all of my stuff as well, and built this sort of shrine-like installation where I mixed in these heads, Henry Moore, and then these photographs as well of the kind of missing women. And there was a woman in each room as well from that photograph series, so they were kind of like presiding matriarchs over each room.
Yeah, it was fantastic. When did you take those photographs? Were they from the 80s?
Yeah, most of them.
So they all seem quite
at the same time, yeah. Well, Bridget Riley was quite young. There was Gillian Ayres and Elizabeth Frink. And then this amazing one of Helen Nassau in the bedroom. So she used to run the Beaux Arts Gallery in Bath.
Oh, not here.
And she's sitting on this object that, first of all, you think it's a bed, but as you look, you realise it's taken in the gallery after hours and all the shutters are closed, and it looks like the sofa from the gallery, which she's put a kind of cloth over, and she's sitting on it, and she just looks like a living doll. She's amazing, like in a really odd way, not glamorous. So that was, the bed was there, and this huge photograph was facing the bed.
Yeah, it was really powerful. So
They lived on there.
yes, I just added this one in.
I haven't seen that. No.
So I was thinking of sort of linking to Rome at this point. And
interesting, because I didn't mention that with the bed.
well, you've got De Chirico.
Yeah, and the step kind of, yeah.
Yeah, so when I did a residency at the British School at Rome in 2014, and didn't really know what I was going to do there, although I had proposed an idea, which I didn't do in the end, which was looking at film locations. So I started just walking around the city and looking at stuff and taking loads of photographs, and I decided to do this collection of paintings of heads of women. So lots of them are from sculptures that I came across, portrait busts in the galleries, but some were from films I was watching, and I was looking at all these photographs of really intricate African hairstyles that seemed to fit with it as well. And they just kind of grew until there was a whole bunch of them. It became Belladonna, which is obviously a beautiful woman in Italian, but also was a herb that was used.
Deadly nightshade, isn't it?
Women used to drop it in their eyes to make their eyes bright, which I thought was a really nice little story about the dangers of trying to look too beautiful.
It's also a homeopathic remedy
Yeah.
for high fever.
Oh, is it?
Yeah, yeah. So your cheeks have to be really, really red, and you have to be burning a high fever.
Okay.
And that's when you take belladonna.
And maybe die. You take too much. Yeah, and I think because I do like working with colour usually, I really enjoy using colour. It felt, because I was in Rome, like I should be a bit more classical, so everything went black and white, which was quite
It's really interesting,
fun.
isn't it? Yeah.
And mostly I made them, made these on a black ground, and sort of subtracted the space. What's that called when you do that? I can't remember. Anyway, I kind of tried different ways of making them, but just ended up with black and white. So started with white or started with black, and added and subtracted to bring them all together. And that leads on to this, which is one of my favourite films, The Roman Spring of Mrs. Stone. And this was something that while I was in Rome I kept coming back to. It's the most beautiful film, I think, the actual staging of it. Although there are a few scenes of this is Vivian Lee that's in it, and it's a Tennessee Williams story of an ageing woman whose husband dies, and she goes to Rome. She's very, very wealthy, and there was a big American expat community in Rome after the war who were very wealthy compared to the population, and they used to take advantage of the young people who needed money. Like that. So there were lots of gigolos around. So Vivian Lee's in Rome, and she ends up with a gigolo who is played by Warren Beatty, quite surprisingly, in his first film role. But she lives in this amazing apartment, which actually was in Elstree Studio. It wasn't in Rome. I don't think she actually went to Rome at all.
Shame.
I know. And wears these beautiful kind of goddess classical dresses that you could imagine seeing in a film about the Greek gods or Roman gods or something, with pleating and sort of bits thrown over the shoulders. And she's a great dressing table. And I love those flowers that are next to her. I don't know if they're real or fake. But anyway, and she's got a little portrait bust on the table.
She has, yeah.
So the film looks amazing, and it's kind of this really interesting story. She describes how she's drifting, and that's what she does all her time in Rome, because she doesn't really know anybody, so she's just walking around drifting. And I felt when I was there, I was doing something quite similar. I was just walking around looking at stuff, so it was kind of influential in that respect. Oh God, more of my things. And so these are two more, these are two more paintings, and the Black Venus was again made from something that I encountered in Rome, and then I worked on a bit more when I got back. I had this amazing collection of imagery of stuff that I'd seen when I was in Rome that I carried on working with. Yeah, carry on.
No, it's really interesting those that when you knock out the colour, when you were talking about the seriousness and you doing the makeup on purpose.
Yeah.
And then what happens when you knock out the colour?
Yeah. And it becomes, I don't know, does it become more serious? I don't really know.
Well, I think in a way it does, because you're limiting what you're talking about, aren't you? You're literally honing things down to the form, and there's not as much to take in. So this is really interesting because you've brought the colour back, but it's not describing the figure or the face in any way.
Yeah.
And it's not obeying any real logic, because you're crossing over the plinth as well with it, so you're getting very formal, aren't you, with where you're going, it's a painting, I'm not pretending this is real in any way. And I get really excited by these, that
that sort of tension between all of
Yeah,
those
no, that
things.
wasn't a sort of happy accident. There was a lot of repainting of this particular painting.
Yeah.
And then I quite liked the pink lines because I thought they looked like one of those really
Big
cheap.
curtains.
Oh, I thought it looked like a paper bag.
Paper bag,
You
yeah.
know those pink and white
Yeah,
striped
I
paper
do,
bags
yeah.
you get. So I sort of like that aspect of it. But yeah, I do quite enjoy the way it goes behind and in front, and she
Yeah.
really do that. It's sort of quite fun. I quite like flattening objects and then maybe just picking out a bit to pull it forward, just to try and play with it a little bit
Yeah.
and to stop it being too representational.
Yeah. And there's that lovely ambiguity between it being a shiny mannequin or ceramic, and then it looks like it could have a dress on as well. So all
Mhm.
those things
Mm.
kind of.
Yeah, I think maybe she did have a dress on originally, but yeah, I know what you mean. And then next to it is a painting that is inspired by a Breton costume, and yeah, just really interested in those. I love those Gauguin paintings of the women with those crazy hats on, and I went to Brittany and realised that probably those women didn't really ever walk around like that, and that they just got dressed up for Gauguin and hey, come put your Breton hat on for me. But that's still what we want to
like
see.
Priscilla.
Yes. But they are, there was just something about this particular display which I just thought was so cool, because it is just such a great way to hide, just to put on this thing, and but yet still, as with your reduced sculptures, it still reads as a head, doesn't it? With
Yeah,
the scarf
yeah.
on, even though there's not really
So
much
so
there.
that was something you actually came across then, that
Yeah,
mannequin?
more or less.
Yeah.
I mean, I think I've changed a bit, but I did see something like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
I like to have something physical to start off with. Yeah, and then maybe mess around with it a
That's
bit.
really interesting. I've never seen that one before. I really like that one. I mean, it does look like you've got up one day in your studio and folded some paper up, put it on top of the mannequin.
Yes. It would have been easier to do that than going to Brittany. So now we get on to these ladies.
Oh, yeah. So, yeah, I couldn't talk about my work without talking about Degas and this particular very famous sculpture that you're all familiar with, the little dancer, age 14, and this is a bit like one of those things where you say, one of those things that you go back to and you feel like maybe you shouldn't, but you do, and then after many years you go back to it and go, aha, this is why I've been so fascinated with it. So, you know, on one hand, it's this, you could view it as this beautiful thing, it's a ballet dancer, it's a dressed up dolly, there are all these kinds of reasons to like it, and then you read about it and realise that it was such a problematic object when it was made and created so much kind of an uproar, which we find it probably quite difficult when we look at it now and say, why was that so contentious, why did it cause so much trouble? You know, it caused trouble for lots of different reasons. It was a bronze sculpture dressed up in real clothing. People thought that it looked like something low cultural from an anthropological museum, or something that shouldn't be in an art gallery. And they also questioned the girl. She looked common, she looked like a prostitute, she was low bred. So there's all these kinds of discussions about it when it came out. It was the only sculpture that Degas showed in his lifetime that he meant to be shown, but we know that he made loads and loads of these studies in his studio as well. Small waxes that were really, really lively and made for his own study, not made for showing. So there's something about those that I've always been really, really into, because it feels like you're very, very close to the artist and the way they were thinking. But this object to me does that thing that it collides across low culture, high culture, naturalistic representation, something else, and the mixed materials is something for me that has always been a pull. I always make things from lots of different sources and from lots of different materials, and I assemble them. So when I'm thinking about making something that's figurative, it's not a person, it's a figurative object, and it's assembled from lots of different ideas. So the first mannequin is from, I don't know if any of you saw Silent Partners at the Fitzwilliam Museum that was on a couple of years ago.
I didn't see it, but I know.
It was an amazing exhibition and a really interesting, different way into looking at figurative objects, because everybody knows about the Freudian discussion of the uncanny, the uncertainty of something that's dead that becomes alive, and the weirdness of dolls. All of that stuff is kind of well rehearsed, but this was, it was called From Function to Fetish, so it came from a very different direction. So it came from artists needing models and mannequins in their studios to work from, and it talked about how different production methods, as they kind of progressed throughout time, brought these different kinds of objects that could be jointed, moved, and then suddenly started to take on a life of their own, and then it went on into sort of contemporary figuration now. But what I really love about these two things is that you've got limbs that are, some of the limbs are covered with cloth, some of them are painted like your makeup, some of them look medical and functional, and other parts of them look real. And so you have a complete, as you're looking at it, complete fascination of what exactly you're looking at. And that's what really pulls them into me. So my bronze sculpture on the right hand side is the only one that's made out of, after me talking about mixed materials, it's the only one that's made of one material. It's just made of bronze, but it's painted. But it's, the way it's made is that I start off with cloth like a doll, make limbs, and then assemble them, and then I model very traditionally like an old-fashioned sculptor, and then I cast them, and then I paint them. So it's this really kind of a long-drawn process.
I'm going to go on to the next slide, because I'm just aware that we've been
going on.
We've been speaking for quite long.
Yeah.
So these are some of these are in some way inspired by the Degas ballerina.
They're actually they're called Degas dolls 1 to 5. They're taken directly from the poses of the Degas waxes, and then they're reimagined and made in this elaborate way where I make lots of separate limbs and assemble them. So they do the opposite of him working in wax, really. And I've shown them in lots of different places, but the first place I showed them is in the Royal Academy Life Room, and that installation was really about looking at the history of the life model, of academic life room teaching, and trying to say, because the life room was something I was terrified of when I was at art school. I hated it. I hated drawing from the model, and it was about talking about different approaches to the figure and how the figure could be used now. And I staged it in different places. This is in Brighton, where I made with the students a replica of the RA life room seating and kind of restaged it. And it was a working life room. People came in and drew from my sculptures, and there was also a life model there as well. So it became a sort of performative thing. Yeah.
Working life room.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, so these, I thought, these paintings related a little bit in a strange way, because these are inspired by Marilyn Monroe and her presence, but I've removed her from them so that the paintings are just of her dresses without her body in them. So I was just really thinking about the way that clothing, or actually what I was thinking about initially was the way that you can really tell, well I can, that it's Marilyn Monroe even though she's not there. There's something so sort of particular about the shape, and how her clothing so kind of carries that shape. I guess she did like quite figure-hugging dresses. And also, she wore lots and lots of white dresses, and that became very interesting to me. This ghostly presence of her as a sort of not really there person. You know, she just was. She just became so much about this sexy woman wearing white dresses that she wasn't really there anymore. There wasn't really much of a real person there. She was a caricature almost. And
It's quite nice in relation to Rome and the fragment and the colour gone, isn't it?
Exactly. There's definitely a direct relationship.
Yeah.
So they were kind of fun to make. I'm really intrigued by these images. What is going on with this guy taking a picture of the Morton Bartlett?
This is a doll made by Morton Bartlett, who is an American outsider artist he was a commercial photographer. He was Harvard educated, and during his lifetime he made 14 intricate dolls. Is anyone familiar with Morton Bartlett?
Yes. I know as well. I've got a book.
And it was only when he died that they were found in this suitcase all wrapped up in paper, and during his lifetime he made them, he dressed them, he posed them in these very coy sort of tableaus and photographed them, but when they were found without clothes on, they were anatomically complete.
In a disturbing way.
In a disturbing way, yeah. Or some people found them disturbing. It's certainly questionable, but they were never meant to be shown nude. But interestingly, when this doll was bought by a collector that I know, and it was shown a lot in contemporary art exhibitions nude, and of course the content is completely different to if she's wearing a little dress. So I did a project with her a few years ago, and this is my friend, the photographer Peru, taking a picture of her, so I was taking a picture of him, taking a picture of her. And at the same time I was making these, this is when I first started making women, because prior to that, in my previous life, everything I made was sort of children and animals, and I did a show at the Museum of Childhood and got really into looking at these teenage dolls. Dolls was something that I didn't play with when I was a child, and I really wasn't interested in ideas of femininity or girliness, in fact I was quite kind of like, I was a tomboy and I didn't want to know. So to ask the questions about how you could then approach making a female form or a nude it was like a task I set myself, and I suppose I started it then by looking at these idealised objects that have been designed by I don't know who, and these toys are things that you give to young girls and boys, and what that then means, how you depict a body. And so I started scrambling up ideas of different body shapes and bits of doll parts. Yeah, I know. It's too much, isn't there?
I know, it's really good.
Yeah.
Well, these are really fascinating in relationship to these.
Yeah.
Aren't they?
So this is a great example of how those different standpoints, historical, archetypal things and ancient things and a doll might come all together into my work, Reclining Doll, that was eventually cast in bronze, but again made of lots of soft doll parts, stitch parts, and then traditionally model parts, and kind of talking about the whole of the use of figuration in civilization and its change to modernism. It talks about art, hierarchical ideas of what's important, what's more important, a doll or a Henry Moore, why is one more.
So sort of related to those ideas of this imagery or the accoutrements of femininity being downgraded, and
Sure,
the Henry Moore is the important thing, isn't it? Traditionally. But yeah, it's such a great juxtaposition, I think.
Where her face is literally removed.
Yes. Yeah, she's got holes in strange places. Oh, and these are some...
And this is Morton Bartlett's dolls on the right.
With their dresses on.
Mostly with their dresses on, yeah.
What did he do with the photographs he took of them?
He did show some of them. He didn't show many of them, but there's a huge archive of them now. And I did, because I've got a show on at the moment where I've borrowed this doll, the naked doll, and dressed her
And during the research this time round, I found that he did actually photograph that doll in the nude, but for his own public use. And then on the left we've got Hans Delmer, and it's interesting thinking about his work and the other artist in the show that I'm in at the moment called Pierre Molinier, who used dolls. Yeah, we've got too much to talk about.
Yeah, we have got a slide of the doll dress, haven't we? I think later.
Yeah,
but tell me about this first.
So this is a work called. So we're talking about installing in specific situations,
yes,
now, aren't we? So
responding to what
site specific kind of response. So the things that I make in my studio then go on tour basically. So this is a piece called Dummies in a Landscape. On the right hand side, it's installed in the Royal Academy Life Room in relation to the anatomical and the classical casts. So you've got these kind of, again, these really kind of fripperously shocking lady mannequins who aren't quite sure what they're meant to be doing, but they're posed on the table that the life model would normally sit or stand on, and they're against these very serious crochet figures or classical casts from Rome. I mean, it's a brilliant collection. And what I did with those, because I found they really got in the way, so I covered them up with soft heads and turned them into dolls, and just really disappeared them so that I could have the room to myself. I moved my entire studio in there. And then after that, later on in the year, I took the work to Dulwich Museum to install them in Dora Gordine's studio, and the backdrop there was very different, so the content of the work changed. Here the ladies are in front of this almost fascistic plaster relief that she made for the BP power plant. It was a public commission, so they have this very different relationship to the location. So the Life Room was made to teach students, and Dora Gordine's house is much more of a vanity project. It's all about her. It's about the Life Room there is her very own private studio.
And then this is something I'm very interested in. This is a transition gallery. Cathy did a show there, and the current programme of shows that we've been doing have all featured two artists. So they're either working together in some way, or maybe there's some kind of conflict. Different. I wanted to think about different ways that artists could show together. And Cathy decided she wanted to show with Marion Adnams, who is not alive anymore. So I thought that was very interesting, and maybe showed some kind of slightly controlling nature. She's not going to answer that. But it was also very interesting because I hadn't worked before at Transition with borrowing works from artists who aren't around anymore, so dealing with the artist estate and dealing with museums, and that was sort of a bit of a learning curve. But it worked out in the end, luckily.
Yeah.
Because we're meant to have sort of special climatic conditions and control the environment, and we have got a leak in the roof somewhere and things like that, so I was a bit nervous.
But it worked out really well,
Yeah.
didn't it? Well, it kind of, this was straight after really doing the Pallant House show, and I came across Marion Adnams' work in a show actually at White Cube the year before, in that women's surrealist show called Dreamers Awake, and I really loved this painting so much. I think we've got some reproductions of it, haven't we, that we can show later.
Yeah, I've got leaflets.
This paint, I was making this sculpture at the time that, and this is what happens, isn't it, when you're making things, you see things that correlate to that much more clearly. And this, I walked past this painting and it was so striking, the sort of correlation with what I was doing, that I just wondered, after working at Pallant House, I really loved looking at a lot of the surrealist painting they've got there. And she had some kind of connection with them, but she wasn't representing the collection. So I went up to Derby to have a look at some of her work in the flesh. And
what I found that was really brilliant when I was at Derby Museum was that as I walked past her paintings, or as I walked around with the curator, I kept catching glimpses of some of the objects in the cabinets that I was familiar with from her painting. So she lived in Derby all her life, and she was an art teacher, and she'd really drawn from this one place. She lived quite a claustrophobic life. She'd been sort of hauled up there during the war. She didn't have much money, she was quite solitary, she was teaching all the time, but she had this relationship with the museum keeper of collections, and he let her take some of these objects out of the museum, take them home and draw from them. So while I was walking around, it's like the resonance of the object, and then it subsequently be painted, you know, it's just those things that you were doing. And so I borrowed some of the objects as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting to have the objects and the painting together. I kind of feel like it's something that maybe lots of painters wouldn't be
comfortable with
Yeah.
doing. Yeah, to see the kind of what kind of transformation there was between them. But it was really interesting using the transition space as well, because it's so contained, you know, there's no windows in there, and it really seemed to amplify the feeling in her paintings and the things that I loved, the connections between me and her that were to do with being quite cut off and completely obsessed with going over and over and over some same ground, which is a certain part of the work that then you have to rationalise and come out of that as well, you know.
And her work is in the show that opens next week at the Dulwich Picture Gallery,
That's
British
right, yeah.
Surrealism, which I don't know how much they've got.
They've got that, they're using that painting.
Oh really?
Yeah,
Well,
yeah. So that's great.
Yeah. And this is in your current...
This is my current show, yeah, which I'm very excited about because I just opened it on Friday. And you can see dummies in the landscape have been reconfigured again. It's now, this piece is now called the covering. So the blankets have enveloped the figures in this current show, which is, it's a very difficult and interesting conversation between a photographer called Pierre Molinier, who makes some very perverted imagery, the Morton Bartlett doll, and my installation. So there's a kind of conversation going on there.
I haven't seen it. I'm really looking forward to it. Yeah.
And it's in an amazing old Soho townhouse, so it's a really different kind of space again to respond to.
This is another recent project. You've been very busy.
I've been busy. This big meaty one, yeah. So this is, I don't know if any of you saw this, this is The Ancestors that was at the Royal Academy recently. It's just come down, it's been there for about 6 months. And it was a project that I curated with Alison Wilding from the RA collection, where we pulled out, and it's an amazing thing to do, because when you first go down to the stores, you're looking for how you might approach. Basically the remit was to curate some sculpture for free display into the spaces. So it's very much something that kind of grew as we worked on it. So there's this very clear group of objects that were a group of busts. They were almost entirely men with beards and very important. And so we somehow had to be respectful of the history and the heritage of the RA, and at the same time we wanted to have this sort of feminist polemic discussion, which wasn't difficult, because just by bringing them out as a group and showing them together, it was extremely clear what the history of the Academy had been. So one of the things that we did to really kind of complicate things and kind of enliven it was to borrow the Elizabeth Frink gogglehead and put that in the centre of all the men. And Elizabeth Frink was the first female Royal Academician, so from 1768 to 1973 there were no female sculptors at all. So we know there's not been very many painters, but compared to sculpture's so behind painting for so many reasons. So she was the first female sculptor, and she wasn't really very well represented in the collection. So I'd been doing a bit of thinking about her over the last year and done a couple of talks about it. So I borrowed this goggle head, which was great to
So that
throw
wasn't
that in
in
there.
the collection?
That's not in the collection, so
Right.
that's kind of the intervention. And what's in front of her is a death mask of Constable. So you've got these amazing, most of them are RAs making other RAs. Usually it's the student making the tutor, and they're all going, "Oh, we're jolly important." And then there's something like this. The death mask comes in as a kind of reminder of an actual person, not a carved person. And the way that they were shown as well was really important. That they were shown on. We used the breeze blocks from Elizabeth Frink's goggle head. That's a very well known, iconic image of her with her goggle heads on breeze blocks. That I think is almost like the most exciting thing she did, was put those two things together, whether it was done by accident or not, and the filing cabinets and the other plinths, just, they sort of talk about archive and history, and they try and make things much more informal, so they take them down from their pedestal in the corners of rooms and make them into a collection and make them into one installation, one work, really.
And it's so nice with the kind of flashes of colour as well, I think.
Yeah, well, it really, and because when you're talking about colour, you've got white men, and you've got black bronze, plaster and white marble, and there's no other colour apart from Miss Frink's shades. So yeah, the colour was an important part of it.
And this is my current show. This is, again, a site-specific project because it is at a cinema in Letchworth Garden City. It's an Art Deco cinema, and I was asked to make some work to display in, it's actually the bar, but it's like a really nice room, has more of a sort of gallery feel to it, and they hadn't been using it very much. So I decided to look at the year the cinema was made, which was in 1936, and I made some paintings of the actresses that were starring in films in 1936 and to display in the bar, and it's called Star Bar, of course. It's in the bar and they're stars.
Yeah.
And I made the paintings very specifically for the space, so you can kind of see, I don't have great images, but they reflect that, the shape of the way they're installed reflects that window.
That's great.
Yeah, the window's brilliant. And these two round mirrors here are also part of the exhibition. There are a whole series of stars on mirrors, which look a little bit like portholes, I like to think. So you're kind of stared at by various stars while you're drinking whatever you drink before you get to the cinema.
And when you look into that mirror, do you have to peer around them as well
Yeah.
to see yourself? That's quite nice, isn't it?
Yeah. So you just get you're kind of
glimpse.
in conversation with
Yeah,
them.
yeah.
I guess you're next to them, aren't you?
Yeah.
I should have done that. I need to take more photos though. So yeah, this I just wanted to talk really quickly about the idea of mirrors, and they're just a reoccurring motif in my work, but also in your work as well. And I picked out a few films that I just came across images from in my collection of film stills that use mirrors, and mostly round mirrors, although there's one that isn't. They're so often used in films, and there's this idea of women kind of reflecting upon a moment when they look in the mirror and coming to some kind of realisation often, or as in the Bunny Lake one, when she's just realised something terrible has happened, and there's something about it, her image being mediated. So we're looking at her looking at herself, that makes an extra layer of interest and complication, I think. And the seventh victim, which is by the I Walked with a Zombie team, I love so much because this girl is looking for her sister who's gone missing, and her sister runs a makeup company. So she has to hang out in the beauty salon trying to find out what's happened to her sister. It's really good. Yeah. So thinking more about mirrors, I've been starting to make these sort of installations and thinking about displaying paintings in different ways. And I've been making paintings which have mirrors attached to them, so you get multiple reflections, and then often showing them on a mirror as well, so it creates this sort of multiplied image which I think works very well when you're looking at these iconic images of film stars that are reproduced over and over and over again. And then I was in New York just recently and I saw this amazing Rachel Feinstein show, and this piece, she uses lots of mirrors and actually made some mirror paintings in the show. And this piece is called Model, which I really loved. And she's got Saint Sebastian in there as well. Yeah. So this is your from your show at the moment.
Yeah, that's Pierre Molyneux on the left, a self-portrait with doll on his lap. And this is the only image that is reproducible because they are filthy. I mean, they really are porn. So it's kind of like Hans Belmer gone even more wrong. But I mean, that's an interesting one. I didn't choose to work with him. It was more that the gallery approached me and said, "We've got these photographs. We'd really like to show them. Could you respond to them in some way?" So it's always interesting to do that and to think about, what happens to your work when you put it next to this work, and how porous things can be, and how meanings can get pushed.
And this is
by context.
the Morton Bartlett doll.
That's the Morton Bartlett doll dressed. So you can see she's dressed in a similar way to the bed, in this sort of metaphysical dress. So I've covered her up and she's holding this strange object which I call the sphincter disc, which is something that it's a kind of reoccurring thing that started to grow from the studio. And she's standing in front of this mirror which I brought in as well, which relates really well back to your circular mirrors. And you can see the installation reflected in the mirror. So just on Pierre Molyneux, they're actually his legs. So the doll is just the head and a dress. They're his legs, so and the leg in the suit is just, there's a piece of wood down a fake leg. So that's the image that I really like. Yeah. Oh, we've got so much to talk about, haven't we? We were talking about Rome and religious statuary. And I remembered that when I was in Rome 2 years ago, and it was when I was working on my first Pieta sculpture, and we had to go on a family pilgrimage to Rome to actually see it in St. Peter's. But the thing that really stayed with me was finding a replica of it in the ornament shop. Full-size replica almost, and that's me looking very goofy beside it, very excited that I can actually touch it.
You didn't buy it?
I did.
I'm very disappointed.
There's the Ecstasy of St. Teresa, and these things, from the Middle Ages, these carvings. This is what's so wonderful about this subject matter, isn't it? That it's so serious and it's taking on something so heavy, and yet it can be an ornament, a necklace. It can be as cheap as anything. It can be funny. It's got so much range in it. This is my Pieta, which was something that I worked on for about 6 months, trying to find a way around the subject matter that could be contemporary, that could be funny and difficult and hysterical and serious all at the same time. So there's all kinds of formal play going on. And always with my work there's some kind of double-headed other kind of...
I thought this was a different... They were two separate pieces for a while, and then I realised it was the reverse. It's really interesting. Oh, and this is just from my studio wall, and amongst it, if you look carefully, there's an image from my own private Idaho.
That's right.
Keanu Reeves holding... I can't remember who the other guy is.
It's River Phoenix, isn't
River
it?
Phoenix, exactly. Doing a bit of a Pieta, and they are in Rome, I think, at that point.
That's great.
So it's just so interesting how those, iconic religious pieces, the imagery is so powerful that it does kind of continue to be used, doesn't it, and appropriated. And here is another example of religious thing.
Yeah, the Veronica.
So the Veronica, which I always find really fascinating, and this is a painting I made of Lana Turner appearing on a Veronica.
That's great.
As you do.
There's the show that I was just talking about, the covering, is all about fabric, and that I've made a fabric valance that goes all the way around the room, so it's kind of like dressing the room like the bed, and I've painted onto that. So I've been looking at these, so it's weird because I didn't know you'd done that painting.
Yeah, I just thought the reason that I did do that was that these images are just so amazing, and these stars, these magazines are from different times, but around 1930, 1940, and just look at them. I mean, they don't look like real people. They're kind of art objects in themselves, I think. And I mean, the photographs have been, well, especially Joan Crawford in the middle, that's a painting, I think, from a photograph. Often people painted over photographs to give that slightly uncanny effect of something that's neither a photograph or a painting. And Vivian Leigh looks like she's been hand-tinted, I think, as the Elizabethan girl there. Yeah, I just really love them. I think they're just amazing. So, I think we've only got a couple more to go, but I was thinking about obsession and fandom and just finding these images so alluring and how that connects with religious imagery, really. Just the idealisation of people. This is Diana Dawes' painting. Diana Dawes on a plinth, which I think she deserves completely. And she comes from Swindon, and this painting is now in the collection of the Swindon Museum, which is so nice.
What I love about this is that the way it's mounted as well. It's a bit like a film award, isn't it?
Yeah, like an Oscar.
And I talk quite a lot about how in that Ancestors display you could see the massive confidence of the sculptors knowing what sculpture was about in the neoclassical, the way they actually did the plinths and the shoulders. And then in the 70s, there's this moment in the Royal Academy where everything, they basically the sculptor membership, they're not looking at contemporary sculpture and developing amazing, exciting language. They're desperately trying to make figuration work, but there's no confidence, and they're all kind of lumpy, and they're just like put on a cube on a rod like that. There's that kind of wonderful sort of
yeah, I don't know where I got that cube from. It probably was from such a sculpture that and then the piece in the book is this really great new book called Fandom as Methodology, that is a compilation of pieces by different artists looking at fandom and how it can be used as a way of working as an artist, drawing on fandom as a sort of inspiration. And I wrote a letter to Gloria Graham, who's this amazing film star that's not so well known now. Just sort of like, I wanted to talk to her about a few things. And it's in this book.
I read it this morning.
Did you?
It's great, yeah.
Yeah, she did lots of strange things to her lips. She's very interesting. And this is our very last slide. Yeah.
Where have the legs gone?
Oh, the legs! I thought they were in there. No, the legs are gone. Sorry.
Sad.
Yeah, we did have this really good image of legs, but
You have to imagine it.
But these are magazines that Garageland and Artie I produce with Transition Gallery, and this issue of Garageland, Difficult Women, features Cathy's sculpture of Dora Gordine on the cover. And so, yeah, I thought I should show it to you. And then this is the Strange Coast pamphlet, would you call it? Leaflet,
yes.
that we have some copies of for everyone. Is that right? And
Publication.
Yeah. And Artie is the other magazine that I make, and this is the Witches special, which is very good. I've got some copies that you can all